Sometimes the smallest repairs lead to the biggest revelations. What started as a simple door fix in a quiet Oregon neighborhood turned into something I never saw coming. A moment of raw honesty from a grieving widow that would challenge everything. I thought I knew about second chances, timing, and the courage to feel again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marc, and at 34, I've gotten pretty comfortable with the predictable rhythm of my life. I run a small handyman business here in Millbrook, Oregon, a town where everyone waves at each other from their front porches, and the biggest excitement usually involves debates over the annual harvest festival. It's the kind of place where people still leave their doors unlocked, though ironically I make most of my living fixing those very same doors when they finally give out after decades of faithful service. I inherited this business from my uncle, Pete, who taught me that every house has its own personality, its own stories tucked away in creaky floorboards and stubborn hinges. Pete used to say that being a handyman wasn't just about fixing things. It was about understanding how people live, how they move through their spaces, what makes them feel safe and comfortable in their own homes. I thought I understood what he meant, but it wasn't until that Tuesday morning in early October that his words really hit home. The call came in around 8 in the morning, while I was loading my truck with the day's supplies. A woman's voice, soft but strained, explaining that her front door was sticking something fierce and she couldn't get it to close properly. "Helen Martinez," she said, giving me an address on Maple Street, one of those tree-lined roads where the houses are old enough to have character, but well-maintained enough to show pride of ownership. I told her I could swing by around 10, grabbed my door tools, and headed out into what I expected to be just another routine repair job. Millbrook in October is something special. The maple trees that give the street its name were already showing off their autumn colors, painting the neighborhood in shades of gold and crimson that made even the most ordinary Tuesday feel like something worth celebrating. I've always loved this time of year, when the air gets crisp enough to make you appreciate a warm cup of coffee, and the changing leaves remind you that sometimes the most beautiful things happen when you're letting go of what came before. Helen's house stood out immediately, not because it was flashy or dramatically different from its neighbors, but because of how carefully tended it was. The lawn was neat without being obsessive. The flower beds showed signs of someone who understood which plants belonged together. And the whole place had that settled, comfortable look that comes from being truly lived in, rather than just occupied. But as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the little details that told a different story. The newspaper still sitting on the front steps even though it was past 10, the curtains drawn tight against the morning light, the way the beautiful landscaping seemed almost too perfect, like it was being maintained by someone going through the motions rather than someone who found joy in the work. I knocked on the door, and when it opened, I understood immediately why the newspaper was still outside. Helen Martinez looked like she'd been up all night, or maybe like she'd been carrying the weight of too many sleepless nights for too long. She was probably in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a way that was practical rather than styled, and eyes that seemed to hold more sadness than any one person should have to carry. But there was something else there too. A strength that reminded me of those old oak trees that bend in the storm but never break. She apologized for how she looked, which made me want to tell her that grief doesn't follow anyone's schedule, and there's no shame in having rough mornings. Instead, I just smiled and asked her to show me the troublesome door. The problem was immediately obvious to anyone who'd spent time around old houses. The door frame had settled over the years, probably helped along by last winter's particularly harsh freeze-thaw cycle, and now the door was catching on the top corner every time she tried to close it. As I knelt down to examine the hinges and check the frame alignment, Helen hovered nearby in that way people do when they're not sure whether to stay and watch or give you space to work. I've learned over the years that most clients fall into one of two categories. Either they disappear completely and leave you to figure things out on your own, or they feel compelled to narrate every step of the process. Helen was different. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding what was wrong and how to fix it, asking questions that showed she was actually listening to my explanations about wood expansion and frame settling. The repair itself was straightforward enough. I needed to plane down the top edge of the door where it was catching and adjust the hinges to account for the way the frame had shifted over time. It was the kind of work that requires patience more than skill, the rhythmic scraping of the plane against wood that has its own meditative quality when you're not in a hurry to get somewhere else. Helen brought me a cup of coffee without being asked. The kind of small kindness that makes you remember why you chose work that brings you into people's homes, rather than keeping you isolated in some office somewhere. We fell into easy conversation while I worked. She told me she'd been in the house for about 8 years, that she and her husband had bought it as a fixer-upper and spent their weekends slowly bringing it back to life. The way she talked about those projects, you could hear the love and laughter that had filled this place. The satisfaction of learning new skills together and creating something beautiful with your own hands. But you could also hear the weight of all those unfinished dreams, the projects that were supposed to be tackled together, but now sat abandoned, because doing them alone felt like an admission that the future she'd planned was never going to happen. I asked her about the beautiful flower beds I'd noticed, and her face lit up for the first time since I'd arrived. Gardening had been her escape, she said, the one thing that felt manageable when everything else seemed overwhelming. There was something about nurturing growing things that helped her remember she was still capable of bringing life and beauty into the world, even when her own world felt stuck in perpetual winter. As I worked on fine-tuning the door fit, testing the swing and making small adjustments, Helen sat on the porch steps and watched with the kind of attention that made me want to do my best work. There's something about having someone genuinely appreciate the craft that goes into even simple repairs that makes you take extra care with the details. Makes you remember that this isn't just about fixing a door, but about helping someone feel secure and comfortable in their own space. The door was nearly perfect when she said it. I was doing a final test of the swing, checking that it closed smoothly and sealed properly, when Helen's voice cut through the quiet autumn morning with words that stopped me cold. You know, Mark, I haven't felt this comfortable having a man in my house since my husband died 3 years ago. I straightened up slowly, not sure how to respond to such raw honesty from someone I'd known for less than 2 hours. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. There was something in her voice that made it clear this wasn't just casual conversation, but a confession that had surprised her as much as it had me. She continued, her voice getting quieter but more steady, as if saying the words out loud was giving her courage to keep going. David was 45 when he had his heart attack. Just dropped dead in our driveway one morning while he was getting the newspaper. The paramedics said it was massive, that he probably didn't suffer. But I keep thinking about those last few minutes when I was inside making his coffee and he was out there dying alone. The weight of her words settled over us like morning fog, and I found myself standing very still, holding my breath as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile trust she was offering me. I'd been in this business long enough to know that people sometimes shared their deepest pain with virtual strangers, especially when that stranger was there to fix something broken in their home. But Helen's honesty felt different, more intentional, like she was testing whether it was safe to let someone new into the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her grief. "I'm sorry," she said, shaking her head as if she could take the words back. "I don't know why I told you that. You're just here to fix my door, not listen to me dump my life story on you." But I did want to listen. Something about Helen's combination of strength and vulnerability reminded me of why I'd always been drawn to work that let me help people, even in small ways. I set down my tools and sat on the porch step beside her, close enough to show I was engaged but far enough away to let her control the space between us. "You don't need to apologize," I said, meaning it completely. Sometimes it helps to say things out loud, especially to someone who's not going to judge you or try to fix everything with advice you've probably already heard 100 times. She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if she was trying to figure out whether I was being genuine or just polite. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she kept talking. "Everyone keeps telling me I need to start dating again, that David wouldn't want me to be alone forever. My sister Patricia means well, but she's been married to the same man for 20 years and has no idea what it's like to even think about starting over. The whole idea of letting someone new into my life, into my space, it feels impossible most days. Like I'm betraying David's memory or admitting that what we had wasn't enough." I nodded, thinking about my own complicated relationship with letting people get close. I'd never been married, never experienced the kind of devastating loss Helen was carrying. But I understood something about building walls to protect yourself from getting hurt again. But sitting here with you, watching you work, Listening to you explain things like I'm actually capable of understanding them instead of just patting me on the head and handling everything yourself, it feels different. Natural. Like maybe I'm not as broken as I thought I was. The autumn sun was climbing higher now, warming the porch and casting long shadows through the maple trees. I could hear the distant sound of kids playing in someone's backyard, the everyday sounds of a neighborhood where life continued to move forward, regardless of individual grief and healing. Helen's admission hung in the air between us, honest and vulnerable and surprisingly hopeful. I realized then that what had started as a simple door repair had become something much more significant. Helen wasn't just talking about feeling comfortable with a man in her house. She was talking about feeling ready to let someone new into her life, to risk the possibility of connection after years of protecting herself from further loss. And somehow, without planning it or even fully understanding how it had happened, I'd become the person she felt safe enough to test those waters with. The door was fixed, swinging smoothly and sealing properly, but neither of us seemed eager to end this unexpected conversation. I found myself hoping that Tyler, my business partner and self-appointed life coach, wouldn't choose this moment to call with updates about our afternoon appointments. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I wanted to be, sitting on a stranger's porch in the autumn sunshine, learning that sometimes the most important repairs happen not to houses, but to the people who live inside them. The weeks that followed that first door repair became a series of small excuses and genuine needs that kept bringing me back to Helen's house on Maple Street. A squeaky hinge here, a loose cabinet handle there, a window that wouldn't stay open properly. Each visit lasted longer than the repair actually required, filled with conversations that meandered through everything from the best local coffee shops to our completely different approaches to Sunday mornings. Helen, it turned out, was a freelance technical writer who specialized in making complicated software manuals sound like something normal humans could actually understand. She worked from a small office she'd converted from what used to be David's workshop, and I could see how difficult that transition had been for her. The space still held traces of its former life in the pegboard holes where tools used to hang and the workbench that now served as her desk, but she'd gradually made it her own with plants that thrived in the workshop's big windows, and the kind of organized chaos that comes from someone who thinks better when surrounded by controlled disorder. I learned that Helen had grown up in Portland but moved to Millbrook when she married David, who'd been born and raised here. She'd fallen in love with the small-town pace after years of city living. But since David's death, the same community, connections that had once felt supportive, sometimes felt suffocating. Everyone meant well, but there's only so many times you can hear, "He's in a better place now," or, "At least you have good memories," before you start avoiding the grocery store, because you can't handle another well-intentioned conversation about moving forward. My own support system, such as it was, consisted mainly of Tyler Chen, my business partner and closest friend since we'd worked construction together right after high school. Tyler had the kind of relentless optimism that could be either inspiring or exhausting depending on your mood, and he'd made it his personal mission to drag me out of what he called my hermit phase, ever since my last relationship had ended badly about 2 years earlier. Tyler ran the business side of our handyman operation while I handled most of the actual repairs, a division of labor that worked, because Tyler had the people skills to charm clients, and I had the patience for the meticulous work that some jobs required. He was also the kind of friend who noticed when I started taking longer lunch breaks and coming back to the shop with a slightly different energy than I'd had in months. "You're different lately," Tyler announced one afternoon while we were organizing supplies in the back of his truck. "Good, different. Like you're actually looking forward to something instead of just going through the motions." I tried to play it off, but Tyler had known me too long to be fooled by casual deflection. He'd seen me through the aftermath of my breakup with Sarah, a relationship that had ended when she decided my lack of ambition for anything beyond small-town handyman work meant I wasn't serious about building a real future. Sarah had wanted someone who dreamed bigger, who wanted to expand into commercial contracting, or maybe start a home improvement franchise. When I couldn't summon enthusiasm for those kinds of plans, she'd accused me of being content with mediocrity. "It's Helen, isn't it?" Tyler pressed, grinning in that way that meant he thought he'd figured something out. "The widow on Maple Street, who's been finding an awful lot of things that need fixing lately." I couldn't deny it, partly because Tyler was right, and partly because I'd never been good at hiding things from him. Helen had become the best part of my days, and not just because she made excellent coffee or because her house had become a comfortable place to escape the pressures of Tyler's constant matchmaking attempts. There was something about her company that made me feel more like myself than I had in a long time, more settled and focused, and genuinely content. "She's been through a lot, Ty," I said, hoping he'd understand that this wasn't a situation for his usual dating advice. "I'm not trying to rush anything or make it into something it's not." Tyler's expression shifted, becoming more serious than his usual teasing. "Mark, you know I want you to be happy, right? But you also know you have a tendency to overthink things until you talk yourself out of taking any risks at all." He was right about that. I'd always been the careful type, the one who measured twice and cut once, who planned for contingencies, and avoided situations where I might fail spectacularly. It had served me well in my work, where attention to detail and methodical approaches prevented costly mistakes, but it hadn't done me any favors in relationships. Meanwhile, Helen was navigating her own complicated support system. Her sister Patricia lived about an hour away in Salem and had strong opinions about Helen's need to get back out there that she wasn't shy about sharing. Patricia meant well, but she had the kind of aggressive optimism that treated grief like a problem to be solved rather than a process to be experienced. "Patricia thinks I should try online dating," Helen told me one afternoon while I was replacing a burnt-out light fixture in her kitchen. "She's convinced that if I just put myself out there, I'll find someone who can help me move on." I tried to keep my voice neutral while I worked, not wanting to influence her thinking, but definitely having opinions about the idea of Helen dating strangers from the internet. "What do you think about that?" Helen was quiet for a moment, standing at the kitchen counter and absently straightening things that didn't need straightening. "I think Patricia doesn't understand that I'm not looking to replace David. He wasn't a broken appliance that I can just swap out for a newer model. What we had was specific to us, and whatever comes next is going to have to be something completely different." Her words resonated with me more than I expected. I'd never lost a spouse, but I understood something about the pressure to move forward according to other people's timelines, to want things that other people thought you should want. "Besides," Helen continued, and I could hear the smile in her voice even though I was focused on connecting wires, "I'm already enjoying the company of a very nice man who doesn't seem to mind that I'm still figuring out how to be myself again." I nearly dropped the wire nuts I was holding. Helen had a way of saying things that were both direct and gentle, statements that left no room for misinterpretation but didn't demand immediate responses either. It was one of the things I'd come to appreciate about her, this ability to be honest about her feelings without creating pressure or drama. Sam Rodriguez, the veteran handyman who'd taught me most of what I knew about the trade, had his own perspective on my situation. Sam had been working in Millbrook for over 30 years and had seen enough relationships bloom and wither to have developed strong opinions about timing and compatibility. "Listen, kid," Sam said one morning while we were picking up supplies at the hardware store. "I've watched you work for 5 years now, and I've never seen you take the kind of care with anyone's projects that you take with hers. You're not just fixing her house, you're making sure everything you touch is perfect, because you want her to feel safe and taken care of." Sam had a point. I'd found myself going above and beyond on every repair at Helen's house, taking extra time to make sure the finish work was flawless, bringing better quality materials than the job strictly required, staying late to clean up every trace of my work. It wasn't conscious at first, but somewhere along the way, Helen's comfort and happiness had become more important to me than efficiency or profit margins. "The question is," Sam continued, loading a bag of wood screws into his cart, "what are you planning to do about it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're both dancing around something that could be really good if you had the courage to name it." The truth was, I didn't know what I was planning to do about it. Helen and I had settled into this comfortable rhythm of friendship and easy companionship, but neither of us had acknowledged the undercurrent of attraction that seemed to grow stronger with each visit. I found myself looking forward to her laugh, to the way she listened when I explained repair techniques, to the small touches of her hand on my arm when she was making a point during our conversations. But I also knew that Helen was still processing her grief, still learning how to imagine a future that looked different from the one she'd planned with David. The last thing I wanted was to pressure her or make her feel like she had to choose between honoring her past and exploring new possibilities. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when I was installing new weather stripping around Helen's front door. The same door that had brought us together in the first place. The rain was coming down hard enough that we'd moved our usual conversation inside, and Helen was working at her laptop while I measured and cut the rubber strips that would keep the cold air from sneaking in around the edges. "Mark," Helen said suddenly, looking up from her computer screen. "Can I ask you something personal?" I set down my utility knife and gave her my full attention. "Of course. Have you ever been in love? Really, deeply, change your whole world kind of love?" The question caught me off guard, partly because of its directness, and partly because I wasn't sure how to answer honestly, without revealing too much about my growing feelings for her. "Once," I said finally. Or at least I thought it was love, at the time. But looking back, I think it was more about wanting to be the kind of person she could love than about actually connecting with who she really was. Helen nodded thoughtfully. "David and I met in college. We were both engineering students, and he was this brilliant, confident guy who could solve any problem you put in front of him. I fell in love with his mind first, then with his kindness, and eventually with the way he made me feel like I was capable of anything." She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her working through something important. But that was 20 years ago, and I'm not the same person I was then. Sometimes I wonder if I'm even capable of that kind of all-consuming love anymore, or if that was something that belonged to my younger self. I thought about her question while I continued working on the weather stripping, trying to find words that were honest but not overwhelming. "Maybe different kinds of love belong to different stages of life," I said carefully. "Maybe what you had with David was perfect for who you were then, and what comes next will be perfect for who you are now." Helen was quiet for so long that I started to worry I'd said the wrong thing. But when I looked over at her, she was smiling in a way I hadn't seen before, like she'd just figured out the answer to a question that had been bothering her for months. "You know what, Mark? I think you might be right about that." That afternoon felt like a turning point, though. I couldn't have said exactly what had changed. Helen seemed more relaxed, more present, like she'd given herself permission to stop comparing her current feelings to her past experiences. And I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were moving towards something that neither of us had planned, but both of us were beginning to want. October was sliding into November when everything started getting complicated. What had been a gentle, private dance between Helen and me suddenly became the subject of neighborhood speculation, family interference, and the kind of small-town drama that makes you understand why some people prefer the anonymity of big cities. It started with Mrs. Kowalski, Helen's next-door neighbor, who had the unfortunate combination of excellent eyesight and too much free time. Mrs. Kowalski had been keeping a mental log of my visits to Helen's house, and apparently, she'd reached some conclusions that she felt duty-bound to share with anyone who would listen. "That handyman's truck is there an awful lot for someone who's just fixing things," I overheard her telling the mailman one morning when I was loading tools from my truck. "If you ask me, that poor woman is being taken advantage of. These contractors see a vulnerable widow, and they figure they can milk her for every repair job they can invent." The irony wasn't lost on me that Mrs. Kowalski was worried about Helen being taken advantage of, considering that most of my recent visits had involved repairs that needed doing anyway, and that I'd been charging Helen significantly less than my usual rates. But small-town gossip doesn't tend to concern itself with facts when a good story is available. Helen heard about Mrs. Kowalski's theories from Patricia, who'd gotten a concerned phone call from a family friend who'd run into Mrs. Kowalski at the grocery store. By the time the story reached Helen, it had evolved into a cautionary tale about predatory contractors who specifically targeted recently widowed women. "Patricia wants to do a background check on you," Helen told me, while I was caulking around her bathroom window, trying to keep the autumn drafts from turning her heating bills into a major expense. "She's convinced that you're either incompetent or running some kind of long-term scam." I set down my caulk gun and looked at Helen, trying to read her expression. "What do you want to do about that?" Helen was quiet for a moment, absently picking at a loose thread on her sweater. "I told Patricia that if she doesn't trust my judgment about the people I choose to have in my life, maybe she should mind her own business for a while." That was the first time Helen had explicitly claimed me as someone she'd chosen to have in her life, and the declaration felt more significant than it probably should have. But I could also see that the family pressure was wearing on her, creating stress about a situation that had been naturally developing without outside interference. The situation got more complicated when David's brother Marcus decided to drive down from Seattle for an impromptu visit. Marcus had been David's closest sibling, and he'd appointed himself as an unofficial guardian of David's memory and Helen's well-being since the funeral. His intentions were good, but his execution left something to be desired. Marcus showed up on a Saturday morning while I was replacing the garbage disposal that had finally given up after years of faithful service. Helen had warned me he was coming, but she downplayed the extent to which Marcus still treated her like a grieving widow who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. "So, you're the handyman," Marcus said when Helen introduced us, managing to make my profession sound like a barely legitimate way to make a living. "Helen tells me you've been helping her with projects around the house." Marcus was the kind of guy who wore expensive casual clothes and had strong opinions about everything from optimal investment strategies to the proper way to maintain home equity. He'd made good money in tech consulting, and he had the confidence that comes from being successful in a field that rewards aggressive problem-solving and quick decision-making. "Marc's been wonderful," Helen said, her voice carrying just enough edge to suggest that Marcus should tread carefully. "He's fixed things that have been bothering me for months, and he's always fair about pricing and timing." Marcus nodded politely, but I could see him cataloging details about my appearance, my truck, the tools I was using. He was evaluating whether I met his standards for the kind of person who should be allowed into his late brother's house, working on projects that David would have handled himself if he'd lived. "David was pretty handy himself," Marcus said, directing the comment to me, but clearly intending it for Helen's benefit. "He always said there wasn't any home repair that couldn't be figured out with the right research and enough patience." "Helen, remember that bathroom renovation you two did? David spent weeks researching tile patterns and water pressure optimization." Helen's expression shifted, becoming more guarded and tired. "I remember, Marcus." But Marcus was just getting started. Over the course of the weekend, he managed to bring David into nearly every conversation, as if Helen might forget that she'd been married, or that her husband had been capable and caring. Marcus meant well, but his constant reminders felt like a test of Helen's loyalty to David's memory, as if moving forward in any way was a betrayal of everything they'd built together. The real confrontation came on Sunday evening when Marcus decided to have what he called a frank conversation with Helen about her future. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I'd left my good drill at her house and needed to pick it up before a Monday morning job. When I knocked on the door, Helen answered with red-rimmed eyes and the kind of forced smile that means someone has been crying recently. "Marcus thinks I'm making a mistake," Helen said without preamble, clearly needing to talk to someone who wasn't going to lecture her about appropriate grieving timelines. "He thinks I'm dishonoring David's memory by spending time with another man." I felt my chest tighten with anger, both at Marcus for putting Helen through this and at the whole situation that had turned something beautiful and natural into a source of guilt and conflict. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that David would want me to be happy and that he trusted me to make good decisions about my own life." Helen's voice was steady, but I could see the toll that standing up to family pressure was taking on her. "Marcus said that 3 years isn't long enough, that I don't know what I'm doing, that I'm vulnerable and not thinking clearly." The worst part was that Marcus's concerns weren't entirely unreasonable. Helen was vulnerable. She had been through tremendous trauma, and she was navigating uncharted territory when it came to relationships after loss. But his solution seemed to be that she should remain frozen in grief indefinitely, as if moving forward was inherently disrespectful to what she'd lost. Things got even more complicated when Tyler decided that the situation called for what he termed strategic intervention. Tyler had been watching me navigate the growing drama around my relationship with Helen, and he'd concluded that I needed backup in the form of community support and character witnesses. "You need people to see that you're not some opportunistic contractor taking advantage of a lonely woman," Tyler announced during one of our Monday morning planning sessions. "You need them to see that you're a decent guy who genuinely cares about Helen." Tyler's plan involved volunteering for the annual Millbrook Community Center fundraiser, a fall festival that brought together most of the town's families for games, food booths, and the kind of enforced fun that small communities excel at organizing. The idea was that people would see Helen and me together in a public setting and realize that we were simply two adults who enjoyed each other's company, not some scandalous situation that required intervention. The fall festival turned out to be exactly the kind of event that creates more drama than it resolves. Helen and I worked together at the ring toss booth, and we fell into our usual easy rhythm of teamwork and gentle teasing. But I could feel the weight of community observation, the way people were watching our interactions and drawing conclusions about appropriateness and timing. Mrs. Kowalski made a point of stopping by our booth to ask Helen how she was holding up with such pointed concern that everyone within earshot understood she was really asking whether Helen was making good choices about her personal life. Patricia showed up halfway through the afternoon, apparently having driven down from Salem, specifically to evaluate the situation firsthand. "You seem happy," Patricia told Helen while I was helping a frustrated 8-year-old aim rings at milk bottles. "But are you sure you're not just enjoying the attention? It's been a long time since someone paid you this kind of focused interest." I watched Helen's face tighten with frustration. Patricia's comment was particularly cruel, because it suggested that Helen was so starved for male attention that she couldn't distinguish between genuine connection and simple kindness from a contractor. "Patricia," Helen said with dangerous calm, "I'm 43 years old, not some teenager with her first crush. I think I can tell the difference between someone who cares about me and someone who's just being polite." But the damage was done. By the end of the festival, Helen was exhausted from defending herself and our friendship to people who seemed determined to find something inappropriate about two adults choosing to spend time together. The joy and natural ease that had been developing between us was getting buried under layers of other people's opinions and expectations. The breaking point came when someone apparently called the Better Business Bureau to inquire about my licensing and complaint history. Sam got wind of it through his network of contractor friends, and he was furious that someone had questioned my professional integrity based on gossip about my personal life. "This is ridiculous," Sam told me while we were installing new gutters on a house across town. "You've been doing quality work in this community for years, and now suddenly people are acting like you're some kind of criminal because you're spending time with a woman who happens to be a widow." Sam was right, but the investigation, even though it turned up nothing problematic, felt like a violation of both my professional reputation and my privacy. Someone had been so concerned about Helen's welfare that they'd taken steps to try to have me investigated as a potentially fraudulent contractor. The worst part was realizing that the investigation had been initiated by someone Helen knew, someone who'd taken it upon themselves to protect her by trying to have me discredited. Helen was mortified when she found out, and I could see that the constant scrutiny and judgment were taking a toll on her confidence about the choices she was making. "Maybe everyone's right," Helen said one evening when I stopped by to check on a loose handrail I'd installed the week before. "Maybe I am moving too fast, or maybe I'm not thinking clearly. Maybe I should take a step back and focus on getting my life sorted out before I try to add someone else to it." Her words hit me like a physical blow, not because I disagreed with her reasoning, but because I could see how much the external pressure was costing her. Helen was second-guessing her own feelings and instincts because other people had convinced her that her judgment couldn't be trusted. "Helen," I said carefully, "the only opinion that matters about your life is yours. Everyone else gets to have their thoughts and concerns, but you're the one who has to live with the choices you make." But even as I said it, I could see that Helen was struggling with more than just other people's disapproval. The constant scrutiny had made her hyper-aware of every interaction between us, turning what had been natural and comfortable into something that felt observed and analyzed. She was starting to see our relationship through other people's eyes, and from that perspective, it was easy to question whether her feelings were genuine or just the product of loneliness and vulnerability. The situation reached a crisis point when David's parents decided to visit, ostensibly to check on Helen, but really to assess whether the rumors they'd heard about her new friend were cause for concern. Helen's relationship with David's parents had always been complicated, loving but formal, and his death had somehow made them both more protective and more distant. "They're driving down from Spokane," Helen told me, her voice tight with stress. "They want to meet you," which sounds supportive, until you realize they've been talking to Marcus about their concerns regarding my recent choices. I could see that Helen was being pulled in too many directions, trying to honor her grief and her memories, while also honoring her right to build a future that felt authentic to who she was becoming. The people who loved her were inadvertently making it impossible for her to move forward without feeling like she was betraying someone's expectations or disappointing someone's vision of how her life should unfold. That night, I lay awake thinking about whether Tyler and Sam were right that I needed to fight for this relationship, or whether the kindest thing I could do was step back and give Helen space to figure out what she wanted without the added pressure of defending her choices to everyone she cared about. The meeting with David's parents was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and by Wednesday evening, Helen was so anxious she could barely sit still. I found her pacing around her kitchen when I arrived to fix a cabinet door that had been sagging for weeks. One of those small annoyances that becomes urgent when you need something productive to focus on instead of dwelling on upcoming confrontations. "They're going to hate me," Helen said without preamble, not even bothering with her usual greeting. "Or worse, they're going to think I've forgotten David, that I'm moving on too quickly, that I never really loved him the way they thought I did." I set down my tools and watched her pace, recognizing the particular kind of anxiety that comes from knowing you're about to be judged by people whose opinion matters to you. Helen had maintained a close relationship with David's parents throughout their marriage, and especially after his death. But that relationship had always carried the weight of being David's widow first, and her own person second. "What's the worst thing they could actually do?" I asked, trying to help her think through the situation logically rather than letting her imagination spiral into catastrophic scenarios. Helen stopped pacing and looked at me with the kind of expression that meant she'd already considered this question extensively. "They could tell me I'm dishonoring David's memory. They could say I'm being selfish or impulsive or that I'm not the person they thought I was. They could decide that I'm not worthy of being part of their family anymore." The last possibility seemed to be the one that scared her most, and I could understand why. David's parents represented her last direct connection to the life she'd built with her husband. The only people left who remembered her as David's wife and who carried those shared memories of holidays and anniversaries and ordinary moments that had made up the fabric of their marriage. "Helen," I said gently, "you're not the same person you were when David was alive, and that's not a betrayal. People change and grow, especially after experiencing something as profound as losing a spouse. The question isn't whether you're still exactly who you were 3 years ago, but whether you're becoming someone who can honor your past while still building a future." But even as I said it, I could see that Helen was struggling with something deeper than just anxiety about her in-laws' approval. The constant scrutiny from family and neighbors had forced her to examine her own motivations and feelings in a way that was making her question everything she thought she knew about what she wanted. "Marc," she said quietly, sitting down at the kitchen table and looking more tired than I'd ever seen her. "What if everyone's right? What if I am just lonely and confused and making decisions based on missing David rather than actually caring about you?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest, not because it was hostile, but because it was so honest and vulnerable. Helen was asking me to help her figure out whether her feelings for me were genuine or just a manifestation of her grief and isolation. I sat down across from her, trying to find words that were truthful without being defensive. "I can't answer that for you, but I can tell you what I see when we're together. I see someone who laughs at my terrible jokes, who asks thoughtful questions about work I've been doing for years, who makes me feel like the person I am is enough exactly as I am. That doesn't feel like someone who's substituting me for someone else." Helen was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her working through something important in her mind. "Finally," she said, "when David was dying in the hospital, I made him a promise that I would try to be happy, that I wouldn't spend the rest of my life just existing in the shadow of what we'd lost. At the time, I thought that meant I would eventually date again, maybe remarry, have some version of the life we'd planned together." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But what I'm starting to realize is that the happiness I'm finding with you doesn't look anything like what David and I had, and maybe that's exactly what makes it real. I'm not trying to recreate my marriage with someone else. I'm discovering what it feels like to connect with someone as the person I've become rather than the person I used to be." Her words gave me hope, but I could also see that she was still carrying the weight of other people's expectations and judgments. The meeting with David's parents was going to be a test of whether she could hold on to that clarity when faced with people who might have very different ideas about what honoring David's memory should look like. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matches your mood when you're dreading a difficult conversation. I was working on a bathroom renovation across town, trying to stay focused on tile spacing and grout lines instead of wondering how Helen's meeting was going. Tyler, who had appointed himself as my emotional support system, kept checking his phone and offering to drive by Helen's house to see if David's parents' car was still in the driveway. "This is ridiculous," Tyler announced around 3 o'clock, setting down the reciprocating saw he'd been using to remove old drywall. "You're acting like you're waiting for test results from the doctor. Just call her and ask how it's going." But I couldn't bring myself to interrupt what was probably an already difficult conversation. Helen needed to work through this situation with David's parents without feeling like she had to manage my anxiety on top of everything else. The call came around 5:30, just as I was loading tools back into the truck. Helen's voice was steady but exhausted, the way people sound after navigating a conversation that required all their emotional resources. "Can you come over?" she asked without explaining what had happened. "I need to talk to someone who's not going to spend the entire conversation analyzing my emotional state and offering advice about what I should do next." I drove to Maple Street faster than I probably should have, my mind racing through possibilities ranging from complete disaster to unexpected success. Helen answered the door looking drained but oddly relieved, like someone who'd just finished a difficult exam and was finally allowed to stop worrying about the outcome. "How did it go?" I asked as she led me into the living room, where I could see evidence of the afternoon's conversation in the form of multiple coffee cups and a plate of cookies that had been picked at but not really eaten. Helen sat down on the couch and rubbed her temples, gathering her thoughts. "It was harder than I expected, but not in the way I thought it would be. David's mom cried, which I wasn't prepared for. Not because she was upset about you, but because," she said, seeing me laugh and seem genuinely happy reminded her of how worried she's been about me for the past 3 years. That wasn't the reaction I'd been expecting, and I could see that Helen was still processing the conversation herself. She said she and David's dad have been afraid that I was just going through the motions of living, that I was stuck in a kind of suspended animation where I couldn't move forward but couldn't really heal either. Apparently, Marcus had told them I was dating someone, and their first reaction was relief that I was finally showing signs of wanting to engage with life again. Helen paused, looking out the window at the November afternoon. "But then Marcus told them about the age difference and the fact that you're a handyman rather than someone with a professional career like David had, and they started worrying that I was making decisions based on loneliness rather than genuine compatibility." I felt a familiar surge of frustration at the way my profession kept being treated like a character flaw, as if working with my hands somehow made me less worthy of respect or consideration. But I tried to keep my focus on Helen and what she'd gone through that afternoon. "David's dad asked me directly whether I was using you as a way to avoid dealing with my grief," Helen continued. "He wanted to know if I was trying to fill David's place in my life rather than creating space for something new." The directness of the question was actually refreshing compared to all the indirect judgment and speculation that had been swirling around us for weeks. At least David's father had been honest about his concerns rather than expressing them through gossip and third-party investigations. "What did you tell him?" Helen smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "I told him that David had taught me to trust my own judgment about people, and that the man I've been spending time with makes me feel like myself again in a way I didn't think was possible after losing David. I said that if David were here, he'd probably like you because you're honest and reliable and you make me laugh." But the conversation hadn't ended there. David's parents had wanted to meet me, not to interrogate or evaluate me, but to understand what Helen saw in this relationship that felt worth defending against family and community pressure. "They want to have dinner with us on Saturday," Helen said, watching my face carefully for my reaction. "Nothing formal, just the 4 of us at that Italian place downtown. David's mom said she wants to see us together so she can stop worrying and start celebrating the fact that I'm building something positive in my life." The invitation felt like both an opportunity and a test. David's parents were offering to get to know me as Helen's choice, rather than as a threat to David's memory. But I knew that Saturday's dinner would be crucial in determining whether Helen would continue to have their support, or whether she'd have to choose between honoring her past and pursuing her future. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own family complications. My parents, who lived about 2 hours away in Bend, had heard through my cousin Rachel that I was seeing someone seriously, and had decided it was time to drive over for a visit and evaluation of their own. My mother had very specific ideas about the kind of woman who would be appropriate for her youngest son. Ideas that generally involved someone closer to my age who could give her grandchildren and fit easily into family gatherings. When I explained that Helen was 9 years older than me and already had adult children of her own, my mother's enthusiasm dimmed considerably. "It's not that we don't want you to be happy," my mother said during a phone call that felt more like a diplomatic negotiation than a family conversation. "But don't you think you should consider whether this relationship has a real future? What happens when you want to start a family and she's already been through all of that?" The assumption that Helen and I hadn't already discussed these questions was frustrating, but I understood that my parents were worried about me settling for something that might not give me everything they thought I deserved. They'd watched me struggle through the aftermath of my breakup with Sarah, and they wanted to make sure I wasn't choosing someone who represented safety rather than true compatibility. The pressure from both sides was starting to feel overwhelming. Helen and I had gone from enjoying a natural, developing connection to feeling like we were constantly defending our choices to people who seemed convinced they knew what was best for us, better than we knew ourselves. But the real crisis came when Helen received a job offer that would require her to relocate to Denver for 6 months to work on a major technical documentation project. The offer was too good to refuse financially, and it represented exactly the kind of career advancement opportunity she'd been working toward for years. "I have to take it," Helen told me on the Tuesday before our dinner with David's parents, her voice tight with conflicting emotions. "It's everything I've been trying to build toward professionally, and the money would give me financial security for the first time since David died." I understood the practical reasons why Helen needed to accept the offer, but I also felt like the timing couldn't have been worse. Just when we were starting to navigate the external pressures and figure out what we wanted our relationship to become, circumstances were going to force us apart for half a year. "When would you need to leave?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "After the first of the year. I'd be in Denver from January through June, possibly longer if the project gets extended." 6 months felt like an eternity when we were still in the fragile early stages of building something together. I wondered if the distance would give Helen clarity about her feelings, or if it would make it easier for her to listen to the voices telling her that she was moving too fast and making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. That night, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about taking risks and fighting for what you want. Part of me wanted to ask Helen not to take the job, to choose our developing relationship over her career advancement. But I knew that asking her to sacrifice professional opportunities for a relationship that was still undefined would be unfair and probably counterproductive. The other part of me wondered if this was the universe's way of telling us that the timing wasn't right, that maybe everyone who'd been questioning our relationship had been correct about us moving too quickly, and not thinking clearly about the practical obstacles we'd be facing. Saturday evening at Romano's Italian restaurant felt like the most important dinner of my life, even though it was supposed to be casual. Helen looked beautiful but nervous in a navy blue dress that brought out her eyes, and I'd spent more time getting ready than I had since my high school prom. David's parents, Margaret and Robert, arrived exactly on time with the kind of punctuality that suggested they were taking this meeting as seriously as we were. The first hour was careful and polite, the kind of conversation where everyone's trying to make a good impression without revealing too much about their real thoughts. Margaret asked about my business and seemed genuinely interested in the craftsmanship aspects of restoration work. Robert wanted to know about my plans for expansion and whether I'd ever considered getting into historic home preservation, which was apparently something he'd always found fascinating. But the real conversation started when Margaret looked directly at Helen and said, "You seem lighter than you have in years, more like yourself." Helen's eyes filled with tears, and I could see her struggling to find words that would explain what the past few months had meant to her without diminishing what she'd shared with David. "I think I forgot how to hope for things," Helen said quietly. "After David died, I got so focused on just getting through each day that I stopped imagining what tomorrow might bring. Marc reminded me that I'm allowed to want things again, to look forward to experiences instead of just surviving them." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Helen's hand. "David would be so relieved to hear you say that. He made me promise right before he died that we'd make sure you didn't disappear into your grief. He was terrified that you'd stop living and just exist as his widow for the rest of your life." The conversation shifted after that, becoming more honest and vulnerable than I'd expected. Robert admitted that he and Margaret had been worried that Helen was isolating herself, using her work and her house projects as ways to avoid dealing with the loneliness and uncertainty of building a future without David. "When Marcus told us about you," Robert said, looking at me directly. Our first reaction was relief that Helen was connecting with someone again. But then we started worrying about whether she was making good choices, or just latching on to the first person who showed her kindness. His honesty was refreshing after weeks of indirect judgment and speculation. I appreciated that he was willing to voice his concerns directly, rather than talking around them. "I understand those concerns," I said, trying to match his directness. "I've worried about the same things. The last thing I want is for Helen to feel pressured, or to make decisions based on loneliness rather than genuine connection." Margaret smiled at that. "The fact that you're worried about it tells me you probably don't need to be. David always said the best relationships were built on people wanting to take care of each other's well-being, not just their own happiness." By the end of dinner, something had shifted. David's parents weren't just accepting my relationship with Helen. They were encouraging it. Margaret hugged me goodbye and whispered, "Thank you for giving her permission to be happy again." But even with that blessing, Helen and I still had to figure out what to do about the Denver job offer. The deadline for her decision was approaching, and I could see that she was torn between the career opportunity and the uncertainty of what 6 months apart would mean for us. The conversation we'd been avoiding finally happened on a cold Sunday morning in early December. Helen had made coffee and we were sitting in her kitchen, watching frost patterns form on the windows and trying to find the courage to talk about the future. "I think I should take the Denver job," Helen said finally, her voice steady but sad. "It's too good an opportunity to pass up, and maybe some time apart will help us figure out if what we have is strong enough to build a real future on." I felt my heart sink, even though I'd known this was probably the practical choice. 6 months felt like forever when we were still in the early stages of falling in love, still learning each other's rhythms and discovering how we fit together. "I understand why you need to take it," I said, trying to sound supportive, even though the thought of her leaving made me feel hollow. "But I also need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. However long you're gone, however much time you need to figure things out, I'll be here when you're ready." Helen started crying then, and I realized that she'd been as scared of losing me as I was of losing her. We'd both been so focused on doing the right thing, on not putting pressure on each other, that we'd forgotten to just say what we wanted. "Mark," she said through her tears, "I don't want to go to Denver. I want to stay here and see what happens. When we stop worrying about everyone else's opinions and just focus on what makes us happy." The relief I felt was overwhelming. "Are you sure? I don't want you to give up opportunities because of me." "I'm not giving up anything," Helen said firmly. "I'm choosing something. There's a difference." That afternoon, Helen called the company in Denver and declined their offer. It was a risk professionally, but it was also the first time she'd chosen personal happiness over practical considerations since David's death. The news of Helen's decision spread through Millbrook faster than we'd expected, generating a mix of reactions that ranged from supportive to scandalized. Mrs. Kowalski made her disapproval known by pointedly ignoring us both at the grocery store. But most of our neighbors seemed relieved that the drama was finally resolving in favor of two people who obviously cared about each other. Tyler was thrilled, of course, and immediately started planning what he called Operation Public Validation, which apparently involved making sure Helen and I were seen together at every community event between Christmas and New Year's. Sam just nodded approvingly and said he'd known all along that we'd figure it out. But the real validation came from Patricia, who drove down from Salem specifically to apologize for the way she'd interfered, and to tell Helen that seeing her truly happy was worth more than any career advancement or family approval. "I was scared," Patricia admitted over coffee at Helen's kitchen table. "Scared that you were going to get hurt again. Scared that you were making decisions based on missing David rather than actually caring about Mark. But watching you two together, I can see that this is different. You're not trying to replace what you lost. You're building something new." Christmas came with a gentle snowfall that transformed Millbrook into something from a holiday card. Helen and I spent Christmas Eve at David's parents' house, a gathering that felt both strange and natural, like we were honoring the past while stepping into the future. Margaret had insisted on giving me one of David's woodworking tools, a hand plane that had been his favorite for detail work. "He would want someone who appreciates craftsmanship to have this," she said. And I understood that it was more than just a gift. It was acceptance, a sign that I wasn't replacing David but continuing the tradition of caring for Helen and the home they'd built together. On New Year's Eve, Helen and I sat on her front porch swing, wrapped in blankets and watching our neighbors set off fireworks in defiance of the town's noise ordinances. The door I'd repaired months earlier was holding up perfectly, swinging smoothly and sealing tight against the winter cold. "You know," Helen said, snuggling closer to me in the cold air, "I never did properly thank you for fixing that door." I laughed, remembering how a simple repair job had led to the most meaningful relationship of my life. "I think you've thanked me plenty." "Have I mentioned that I haven't felt this way since David died?" she asked, echoing the words she'd spoken that first day, but with a completely different meaning now. "You may have mentioned it," I said, kissing the top of her head. "But I don't mind hearing it again." As midnight approached and the fireworks grew more enthusiastic, I realized that Helen had been right about second chances and new kinds of love. What we'd built together wasn't a replacement for what she'd lost, or a consolation prize for what I'd never had. It was something entirely its own, born from two people brave enough to risk hoping again. The door that had brought us together was just wood and metal and hinges, but it had opened onto possibilities neither of us had imagined. When we were focused on what was broken, instead of what could be repaired, sometimes the best things in life come from the willingness to let someone in, to trust that not every ending is really an ending, and to believe that with the right person, even the most damaged hearts can learn to swing open again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.